Hello, and welcome to Get Recc'd. I am your host, Don Falgout.
And I am your other host, Stephen Falgout. Get Recc'd is our podcast where every other week Don recommends something to me and I recommend something to them, and then we talk about it. And it goes like that in perpetuity forever, for all time.
Yeah, the show, this is somewhat thematic, although not quite yet. I mean, it is October. When we become ghosts, which will happen in the next episode. Um, it happens every Halloween. When we become ghosts, we will continue the podcast, so you never have to worry about Get Recc'd going away. The only thing is that when we are doing the podcast as ghosts, you won't actually like hear anything. But if you are watching the stream, you will see the title cards. Because as a ghost, like I'll have access to do those things like in a poltergeist kind of way. You know, like clicking the mouse and pressing the buttons, but you can't really like hear us.
Yeah. And every episode will become a Halloween episode, just by nature of us being ghosts. But who knows, actually? Maybe when we're ghosts, we're going to think that that's kind of offensive.
Well, yeah, of course. And also that does depend greatly on how afraid of ghosts our audience is. You know, some people find ghosts fascinating, not scary, whereas others find ghosts scary.
Yeah.
So it depends. You know, it's really all subjective, I think is what we're getting at. I think that's
true.
the main point that we're trying to hammer home right now.
Because the other wrinkle is, are we going to be friendly ghosts like Casper? Or are we going to be like The Shining? Not the ghost in The Shining, like the movie. Like, are we going to be like the actual 32 millimeter film?
Will the film play?
Yeah.
Every time we stream, I don't know. I do think it would be a bit of a bad idea. We might get shut down pretty fast if we did that, but you know, maybe that's the goal.
Well, the stream won't be the film. It's just when we talk as ghosts, we will just like play the film coming out of our mouth.
And that would not make the stream the film. Well, it would be like the audio podcast version of the film.
Right. Well, like one of us would talk regularly and the other one would just be the film.
So it's sort of like one of those podcasts where you have two people discussing media, for example. Yeah. But
should we workshop it a bit? You be a regular ghost, and I'll be the film.
Right. So I just have to like come up with natural dialogue to counter the things that you say.
Right, but make it a little spookier.
Okay. Well, I mean, it would be because we're both ghosts, right? So already, you know, that part's covered.
Okay, so go. Sorry, folks. We don't always do our vocal warm-ups before the podcast, so Dawn is just doing their vocal warm-ups real quick.
No, I'm doing my ghost warm-ups. Give me a second. Okay.
Hello, I am the Stephen King film The Shining. Hey, you remember Jack Nicholson, right? Here he is again. It's me, Jack. That's his famous quote from me, the film, The Shining. Okay, see, so I think that's pretty good.
That's pretty good. Yeah,
that's what our viewers can look forward to in, I don't know, 1,000 years when we both die. Yeah. Because we also are eternal.
Also, that's assuming that audiences 1,000 years from now remember the film The Shining, but specifically I think you mentioned the Stephen King one, so it would be like the TV movie The Shining. So like we
right, exactly.
So
yeah, I didn't specify earlier, but
that's true. Well, I think that is a great segue into what you recommended to me last time, Stephen, if you'd like to get into that.
Yes, some may say a shining example of board games. That would be Spirit Island, 2017's board game by Eric Royce. This is a board game that kind of came as an idea sort of from a play session of Settlers of Catan, where Eric Royce had the idea. In most board games, you kind of are the aggressor, but what if you are the opposite? What if you are the island trying to defend itself from invaders or settlers? In the game, you can play as many different spirits who exist on the island and help the natural inhabitants try to repel invaders. It is a cooperative game that can be played solo or up to, I think, now 6. Although if you play this game with 6 players, you're insane. With that, I will hand it over you, Dawn, to talk about it. I will mention once again, with our board game playthroughs, although there was one specific case, I think, when we talked a little bit about Legendary, where we had played it in person prior to talking about it. But with our board game reviews, we are typically playing them either through the app or Tabletop Simulator. So in this case, we utilize the Tabletop Simulator mod, a really great mod made by 2 members of a very active Discord community around the board game. So just a little disclaimer there. There are some pretty interesting things that happen with the board game itself, which I'll talk about a little bit, but we did play virtually.
Yeah, and we had 2 games. So in one of them, we played as 2 of the beginner level spirits, or at least the least complex, 2 of the least complex spirits you can play as. And then in the next game, we played as more complex spirits. So there is still a lot that I would have to learn with the game, because it felt like even just playing the 2 different spirits, there was a lot I had to learn in between them. With this game, it's not just the base rules and then you can just pick up and play. You also have to learn your specific spirit every time and how it works, which can completely change the way you approach playing the game. So in those 2 experiences that I had, I think I got a good idea of what that's like, but there is definitely a lot that I could see. Of course, watching Steven play as his spirits helped as well, because they also work a similar way. And then what was also cool is, I imagine that the combinations you can have are quite numerous. It's not just all the spirits you have to pick from, but then also how spirits will play off each other. And I noticed that both times. I believe in the first time that we played, Steven's hero was very defensive, or it was very well, I don't know if it was necessarily defensive, but just the spirit was slow, which is kind of a thing in this game with the way the cards work. But basically, it meant that his actions were more methodical and mine were all fast, but I could also turn other players' actions into fast actions as well. So that alone was a really good dynamic that we had, where it wasn't just that our spirits, we needed to learn our own spirits, but we also needed to understand how they could play together in order to win. And there are a couple of win conditions, but I think both times we won the exact same way, which was just whittling down the fear card deck until the win condition became easier, and then beating that win condition. And it was cool though, because I felt like both times we played, even though we won pretty much the same way, I think even at the same fear level, it didn't really matter. It still felt like we were playing a substantially different version of the game. And that was probably the coolest thing about it. The base game itself is already a little bit complex. There's definitely a lot to consider. Although, like, that's not just like win conditions, that's considering where the explorers will move around the board. That's considering which type of cards are going to best help you at any given time. Considering which actions are best to do at the start of your round, and weighing good options against good options and trying to figure out what to do. That already is pretty complicated, but it got a lot more interesting when you then threw on top of that, like, okay, well, so I made all those decisions, but what specifically do I want to accomplish to get to that win condition? And there are a few ways to do it. it's hard to perfectly describe it without explaining all the rules. It is a little bit of a complicated game to explain, I think, just in words. But I'll say the first time we definitely played the game a lot more aggressively in terms of trying to actually destroy the explorers' settlements. Whereas the second time we were more focused on just scaring the explorers using the fear cards because my spirit generated a lot of fear to try to win that way. And um I guess there is no and. That was cool.
Yeah, I think one thing what's interesting is this game. So Board Game Geek, probably the largest and oldest repository of board game reviews and board game metadata, has a 4 out of 5 complexity rating. What I think what's interesting about this game is like at its very core, at its very most basic, it's pretty straightforward. You have some spirits, you're trying to fight the invaders back, they will explore an area, they will build in the same area, and then they will attack the land. You're trying to stop them from putting a whole bunch of blight onto the land, which is after they attack. You're trying to stop them from either destroying any spirit completely off the board, and you're trying to do it in an amount of time that you can't just stall out. Basically, there's an internal timer. But where this game is incredibly complex is the decision space. There are so many decisions that you can make at any given time, and the mental math that you're doing, trying to understand your own spirit's intricacies, those, and then layering in your teammates and how you can interact together, and what do I want to play that goes fast, which is a thing that will happen before the invaders get to do anything. What is something I want to play slow to set up for the next turn, or even preempt them doing something this turn that I can take care of after they do something? There's just so much thinking that goes on. At times, I'll be honest, it can definitely be overwhelming for sure, especially as a new player and as you get into a new spirit, you're really having to kind of grapple with everything that's going on, both just like within the game itself, but then also like with what your spirit's doing. But it's so fulfilling finding those combos and understanding your spirit. And I found with this game a lot of times, honestly, you're like overthinking things so much all the time that sometimes it's like, oh hey, wait a minute, we won. Like I think we could win this turn, like let's just take a step back and like play to win this turn. And that sort of stuff is so fun to me. And all of the different spirits, you mentioned it, like we played both low complexity spirits and then some medium / higher complexity spirits, which I'll talk a little bit about as well, feel so distinct too. Like they feel so unique. And some of the spirits, especially in that, for instance, in like the last play that you and I had, like completely changed the way that you think about the game too. Like not just do they do something different, but the different thing that they do is like completely different than the core mechanics of the game. So there's a lot going on, but it all just feels so enriching.
Yeah, and it's also, I think that the core game itself, looking away from the strategy and all of that comes into play with all of the extra spirits and all of the things that can happen with different combinations. Just the very core design of how the game progresses round to round, I thought was really cool. It was, I don't know. I mean, you've definitely played a lot more tabletop than I have, so I don't have a lot to compare it to, but I would say that at its core, the game actually is pretty complex. There are, even if you look away from the needing to understand your own spirit, I would say even just even just within a round, there's a lot that happens, a lot of different things across the board that are affected, whether it is the island itself, the different types of pieces that move to each spot, and then you have the fear deck, you have another deck of cards for what the explorers are going to do each round, and that changes every time. Then you also, in addition to that, have like the fast and the slow rounds. You have two different type of cards that are played different times. I would say that just moving action to action in this game is fairly complicated, just in terms of like if I were to sit down and try to explain to someone how a round is played and they've never seen the game, I think they would get lost almost immediately. Maybe you could say that about any board game. You probably do need it in front of you. But my only point is that there's a lot that happens within one round, and I was very impressed to find out that it does play very naturally, and the movements in each subsection of the rounds, or turns, I suppose you would call them, um, those are all really interesting. Like each one, I thought the layout of having you have the starter moment where you kind of decide in your first actions that how you're going to grow your spirit and progress your spirit's presence around the board or collect cards. A lot of that's building up your deck and also building up your ability to play to have more options later in the game. That was very smart to put at the beginning, and then I really liked the difference between the fast and the slow cards. So you have cards that you can play in the next round um, that will actually take effect before the explorers do anything, and then the explorers do something, and then your slow cards take effect. I thought that was really interesting, which added just that extra layer of strategy to what cards to play. Certain cards might look very good, but if they don't play exactly when you need them, they might not actually really help you in that moment. And it adds that extra layer of complexity, but in a pretty fun way. I will say that I think the amount of complexity that is here, and I feel like I only really scratched the surface anyway of that, is definitely pretty off-putting. I think I think what's nice about the game is having the way that it actually tells you like how complex each spirit is on their card. So you have a better option. Like if you're new to the game, you're not going to be completely lost. If you want to try to learn it, you can pick from only the lowest complexity heroes. And that already gives you a pretty fun selection just right there. That's really nice. And that's something I'm glad that they thought about because I do think this game is complicated. Even when I played it for the first time as a low complexity hero, it definitely took me a while to really understand the machinations. And that was even with playing with Steven, who was very experienced with the game. If I picked this up with somebody for the first time and we both had to learn this game, I think I wouldn't be able to do it. It would be too much for me. Um, but I really appreciate the addition of the different complexities of heroes to give people an easing in point. And it's not just an easing in point. I think those heroes were fun. They weren't. It wasn't like when I went to the high complexity hero, I felt like I would never want to go back to a low complexity one. The way that my hero was played, the way that both my heroes were played across both games I played, were so different. Not just in complexity, but also just in their abilities and stuff. That either one would be fun. Like all of those spirits are clearly things you might want to play, no matter how advanced of a player you are at the game. So it's really well designed. There was a lot of thought that went into this beyond just the concept, which I'll talk a little bit about later, which I also like. But even beyond that, there's a really, really strong game here that is complex, yes, but also gives you a lot of options to tackle it at your own pace.
Yeah, one thing that I think that this game does really well is there are so many spirits, an insane number of them, and they keep growing. And there's another expansion coming out. And to your point, actually, I had talked about this a little bit on the streams of our play, but between the time when I recommended this and when we played it, there was a Target exclusive version that came out that has only low complexity spirits. It also downgraded a lot of the physical components and such to make it a little bit of a cheaper version as well for a big box store. But low complexity in this game does not mean less powerful. I think that's so important. The low complexity spirits easily stand up against any other spirit in the game. Not all of them are as strong as some that have come later, but that's more just kind of expansion power creep than I would say based on its complexity. But even still, a lot of the low complexity spirits are powerhouses, and that's good because you don't want to give someone who's new to the game a spirit who just feels worse than any other spirit. But it's great in that regard. The other thing I wanted to mention is that the spirits feel incredibly thematic. Like you mentioned in our first play, you played Lightning Swift Strike, and I played the big stone guy. the stone guy, most of the powers are slow, like a big giant rock spirit. And so it makes sense that my powers are slow, but as I ramp up, then I really can start to do some damage and some destruction. And lightning can go really fast or can go slow. It's kind of their choice, just as lightning might move kind of erratically. That's all really fun to me. And like I talked about, we didn't play it, but I talked about Ocean's Hungry Grasp, which is I think my favorite spirit from the base box, and I think it's the highest complexity spirit in the base box. But thematically, the Ocean's Hungry Grass exists in the ocean, and the presence will go out into the coast and then have to recede back into the ocean like a wave, kind of going back and forth out of the coastline. I think that's so cool. There's just a lot of little touches like that that are really interesting. And there's even more, you kind of mentioned it, but there's like not only are there spirits and those sorts of things, but there's even more that we didn't even touch. Like there are different scenarios which kind of change up some base mechanics. There are adversaries which adds level of difficulty and make the invaders thematic and historical. So it's, pseudo historical if this island were to exist, but you can play against actual historical civilizations, Russia, France, etc., who were at many times invaders. So there's just a lot going on, and I think that's really great. The other thing that I forgot to mention at the top, in our second play, we did play with some of the expansion components, just like we did with Arnak, the last board game rec. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about those. So those add some tokens which do certain things. They add event cards which can really shake things up.
I mean, I guess I don't have much to say because I didn't have enough experience with the game at its base, but I can say that even once we added in the expansion, the things that were different from the first time we played came in pretty naturally, I think that those we had like these we had tokens that you could place on the land that would have certain effects to help block or defend. You had I forget what they were called, but they like at the start of every explorer round, we had some additional considerations to make.
Those were the event cards.
The events, yeah. So I thought that all was a fine addition to the game. And like I think that what is nice is that even though the game is complicated, and I definitely think it is, I also think that it your goal is simple enough to where a lot of the extra complications that are added on top of it don't really overwhelm too much. It's pretty easy, I would say, to stay focused on what your goal is. And that's really important. So when something else comes up and maybe adds a little bit of complexity, it's really contextualized into what you're trying to do and what the invaders are trying to do in a way that makes it pretty easy to grasp, like right then and there. Those event cards, for example, they did add extra considerations to rounds, which you already have to make a lot of considerations in, but they only happen midway through. You don't have to it doesn't add too much burden on you at the start. And by the time you get to that explorer round, you already know what's about to happen. So having those considerations you had to make at that moment was really nice, and it helped contextualize it, make it easier to make those kinds of decisions because you already know what you've done and what the explorers are now trying to do. I can't speak to every single thing. There definitely were some things I saw that we could have added from the expansions that I thought looked like they might have been too much, but I can't really say because I haven't played with them.
I'll just quickly talk about the actual physical board game, which is not something that we necessarily touched, but I think has a lot of little interesting touches. This game has what I think is probably the most thematic components I've ever seen in a game, where every card that or piece, every card or piece that exists as the player are made up of natural components, or components made of natural some natural material, I guess I would call it. There's cardboard. The Dahan, the natural inhabitants of the land, are wooden pieces. The cards themselves, those sorts of things. The invaders are unnatural components, so they are all plastic. So that's the invader pieces as well as the blight pieces are all plastic. I think that's just such a cool little touch. Such a small detail as well, but it's just, I find it so fascinating. The board itself is really interesting. It's like this really odd shaped jigsaw piece, and every player has their own starting board, and so these jigsaw pieces like attach together, and actually you can attach them together in almost like any number of different ways, and depending on how you do it, it makes the game slightly more difficult or easy. There is like a recommended setup for each player count, but you can kind of do it however you want, honestly, which I think is super interesting. There's a thematic side of the board, which is the back side of every board, which instead of what kind of we're looking at on the screen here, is like just kind of pastel color, or like just basically like abstracted versions of each of the different land types: wetlands, jungles, sands, etc. The backside of the board looks more like what a true island may look like. I'll say one thing about that. I don't like that side of the board. It actually makes everything a lot fuzzier and kind of harder to read. But it is there, and I think that's kind of interesting. So there's a lot of little touches within the game itself that I actually like quite a bit, just from a component standpoint, which is not something I talk about a lot, but
yeah, and
it is very interesting.
That brings me into thinking about the concept here, which is a really cool thing. And you touched on that in the beginning with how the creator of this board game noticed other board games where you are invading lands and flipped that on its head, where now you are the land that is being invaded and you are working with nature and spirits to take your land back. And that is just a really cool creative concept, and it's also interesting to me because the last board game we just talked about, which was Lost Ruins of Arnak, this almost feels very ever so slightly, and I know that this is not these games are not related in this way, but it almost feels like a fuck you to that. Not specifically, but in the sense that, you know, that game's like your archaeologists exploring lands and taking artifacts, which is like in the Indiana Jonesy kind of way, like this belongs in a museum type shit, which is already kind of an issue because it's like, how is that yours? So we played that board game. We played an example of a board game where perhaps you're not really invaders, but certainly, well, I mean, yeah, you kind of are. I mean, you kind of are. In fact, in that game, you would go and explore lands which you would encounter a spirit guarding that land that you would have to destroy, well, tame, and then to take stuff from the lands. So it's almost like this game is like the opposite of that. I'm sure there's more, you know, strong comparison points to other games that are more directly tied. And you mentioned Settlers of Catan, which this game, I guess, is sort of a rebuttal to in some way. Whatever the case, I just thought that was interesting. That parallel was interesting. And yeah, and I think it's just kind of a neat idea that you mentioned about how thematic the creation of the physical board game is, but also just the concept in and of itself is pretty transgressive maybe for the medium, which is interesting. And I think it was done in a way where it's like legitimately a really fun game. It's not even, it doesn't really come across like it's even doesn't come across like it's some sort of parody of the things it's criticizing. It's a fun game in itself whose concept stems from a critique of other games and the medium itself. And that is cool.
I want to say I also know that the designer is very, I don't know, meticulous and thoughtful about making things historically accurate, trying to be very respectful of historical situations where things like this occur. I know that they have openly talked about adding in potentially an expansion that really focus in on the Dahan. Eric Royce has said that he's been actually working with some representatives of indigenous populations and um, communities that historically have been impacted by invadership, and trying to get something that could, even bolster kind of the natural citizens of this island in the game, which I think is really interesting. So there's just a lot of respect there as well. It wasn't just like, oh, I see this happening a lot in board games and I want to flip it on its head. It was also very respectful of that kind of historical notion as well.
Well, should we get into the final thoughts here?
Sure.
Yeah, well, okay, I'll go first. I really liked Spirit Island from the amount that I've played of it. It would be a thing I'd totally be down to play again. I think playing it physically would be really interesting, as well. There's a lot that I have not seen and a lot I would like to see, but just from what I did, I found it to be a lot of fun. Um, when it comes to not even necessarily criticisms of the board game, but just like personal um things that personally hold me back with this game. It is it is very complicated, and I think I got a grasp of it. It's not like I didn't understand what was going on, but I do think there were points throughout each of the two play sessions I had where I started to not get lost, rather I just started to kind of lose a little bit of focus because I did feel a little bit overwhelmed with all of the decisions that I could make. And I think I do in general tend to prefer games that play extremely thoughtlessly. Um, that doesn't necessarily mean they have to be simple. It's just games where the considerations you have to make are more immediately understandable. There's less that I have to sit and really ponder about. Um, I think I probably would tend to prefer that. And this game is a game where you definitely have to think about what you're doing a lot, and there's a lot of stopping and working with people to make those considerations, which is all stuff that makes it fun and social, but a little bit hard to approach. That's not really a criticism of the game because I don't personally feel that they handled anything poorly. I don't think there was anything that was needlessly complicated. It just is complicated. That's just the nature of the game. But I did really like it. I would say if I would be curious to find out, which I'll never be able to get this experience because you taught me the game. I'd be curious how unapproachable this game would be if you and like say one other player had never played it before, you just bought it and now you have to read the instruction manual and learn the game. Like it feels like it would be extremely extremely hard. It would I would imagine it's not the kind of game you could pick up in only one play session that way. And that's fine. But I wish I could have had that experience to color my perspective a little bit, and I don't. And anyway, I would recommend this game to people who have somebody who knows someone who knows the game, or watch YouTube videos. I mean, there's plenty of YouTube videos where people, explain a game to you. So just have a guide of some sort if you're going to play this. But I think if you do, and you have other people to play the game with, which you need, this is a really, really interesting co-op game that ends up playing fairly naturally once you get into it, and just a lot of interesting complexity to dive into if you want to play the game more and more. There's a lot you can keep getting out of it. So I would probably give the game. I'll stick to an 8, like I did with Lost Ruins of Arnak. I think one limitation for me with talking about tabletop games in this show is that if I have only gotten to play them a few times for the show, I think sometimes with this medium, that's not necessarily enough for me to know how much I love that board game. Maybe with a game like this, I would need a lot more time with it to see that. But regardless, I did enjoy it a lot, and yeah, that's it.
And then for me, this game is just really consumed my life. It is a game that is so easy to just dive headfirst into and really play a lot. I'll mention that it has a really good digital version, both on phone and, just through Steam and other digital storefronts. and it plays super good at one, either with a solo spirit or two-handing, so playing as two spirits. Both of those feel really interesting and unique, so that helps as well. But it's just such a good game, really. I don't think it takes my board game top spot, but it is climbing up the charts really fast. Easily my number 2 board game of all time. It's just so thinky, and I like that a lot about it. It's so interesting. There's so much different strategy you can employ, so many ways to really change the game up from a difficulty perspective or not. One thing I'll mention, you mentioned what if someone were to just pick it up and could they really get through it? I'll say I will personally recommend to people that new version, that $30 Target version, if you are interested in Spirit Island. I think that's a perfect gateway to Spirit Island. I've heard from people who have not gotten into the game that it doesn't necessarily decrease the board game's complexity, and they were very cognizant of that. That was something that they didn't necessarily want to do, but it does really ease you much better into the game itself. A instruction manual that really like talks you through a first play. There are some other things that you can do in a first play that Dawn and I actually didn't do, like not having to worry about power progression and those sorts of things, which is an aspect of the game. So that would be the gateway that I would suggest to people. All of the spirits in that pack are low complexity and probably even maybe lower complexity than the low complexity base game spirits. So I would probably go with that one. But wow, it's hard for me not to give Spirit Island a 10. Honestly, it really is just such a good game, and I feel like I haven't even scratched the surface, and I've played a ton of it already. So I'm excited to dive in even more. And like I mentioned, there's another expansion coming out soon, so I'm excited for that. And I picked up the Target version for the new spirits as well, so excited to try those, which I haven't yet. But I definitely recommend it to people. But as Don mentioned, it is a complicated game for sure, and it's going to be hard to get into. It's not one that I would be like. It's certainly not a gateway game, that's for sure. Like if you've only ever in your life played like the Milton Bradley Hasbro games, I would not recommend jumping up to Spirit Island for sure. But maybe Pandemic first and then Spirit Island. That's a really natural progression, I think. If you played Pandemic before, this one I feel like is a little easier to kind of ease yourself into because you might be very familiar with this style of co-op and this style of co-op thinking. But anyway, yes, I highly recommend Spirit Island.
All right, now we'll move on to what I recommended to you, Steven, which is a continuation of the anime Neon Genesis Evangelion. We are going to talk about episodes 7 to 12 today. It says 13. That was the recommendation, but Steven went to 12. So we'll just go there and we'll talk about 13 to 19 next time. Just as with last time, we are not going to really give final thoughts on the series. I don't think we should jump into a score or a recommendation yet. We have not finished the show, but it just isn't really feasible to do an entire series and a film in one episode. So that this is, it's still a bit of a new thing. But anyway, I will let Steven talk about these episodes and also, any thoughts about the series as a whole. If this has brought new context to earlier episodes, it doesn't matter. Just, we're going through it and giving our thoughts as we do. So I will. I was going to say hop it over to Steven. I don't know what that means, but that's what I'm going to do. So, Steven, if you would like to talk about Evangelion.
This batch of episodes I cooled off on, I'm going to say. I think that I found that first batch of episodes incredibly compelling. There was a lot going on in that first batch of episodes, just stylistically, and just some incredible decisions made in production and direction. This batch of episodes definitely felt like it kind of got into this very formulaic rhythm. That's not to take away from the fact that I still feel like there were some incredible direction moments. There were some really interesting shots and decisions, but it felt more like every episode started kind of to become a monster of the week and not so much making any more a statement. I don't want that to sound like I didn't like this batch of episodes. I still liked it quite a bit, but it definitely was much cooler on this batch of episodes than I was the first 6. Starting with going into the episode right after the 6th, which I thought was quite interesting, where you have this rival organization that has a robot on the loose. And so everyone's trying to figure out what that means, and they have to stop this robot that clearly didn't do a very good job in designing. But from that moment on, Asuka comes into the picture. She's a character that I don't know how I feel about right now, although she does have some really, really good moments within this batch of episodes. The humor started to get a little more kind of slapsticky. Wasn't super fan of that. I noticed that a little bit in the first batch of episodes, and I feel like they're kind of falling into it a little more here. But I don't know, it just started to feel more like a formula every week than it did more of a statement.
Yeah, definitely. I think that this batch of episodes is where Evangelion becomes, for a while, it becomes a standard anime mech show. And the concept still is grand. The ideas are still present, but if you say started here and only watch these episodes, which isn't much of a point because why would you do that anyway? But if you did, you wouldn't really notice any of that, right? Like that's all carryovers from the beginning of the series. And now we're really into the point where all those things have been addressed. They've mostly been they've been established. You know, there's still a lot of mystery right now, but the ideas that have been established have already been established, and this section of episodes doesn't necessarily add a lot. So you get Asuka, she enters the picture, and she's very much at this point a foil to Shinji and to Rei because she's very full of herself. She's very mean, and she is seemingly more of a conventional anime protagonist in the sense that she's very sure of, she feels as though she's very sure of herself. She sees herself as a hero, something that Shinji and Rei definitely do not from what we knew of them. And what I do really like about her addition in these episodes, and maybe the one thing that continues to set Evangelion apart even in this moment, is the fact that you put a character like that up against characters like Rei and Shinji, but particularly Shinji. That's where so much of the interesting dynamics that are more unique to Evangelion really show up. Because now you have, if it was a show just about if it was a show just about Asuka, she wouldn't really be this annoying, mean character. She wouldn't have anyone to pit up against. She would just be your standard anime hero. But you put her up against somebody like Shinji, who doesn't like what he's doing, doesn't really see that much purpose in it, doesn't really know why he's doing it. Now she is a foil. Now she, keeps calling him an idiot for not knowing things and stuff, which I think is a really interesting dynamic, though not necessarily fully realized yet in the series. When you look at other elements that you mentioned, such as the you called it slapstick, I guess just that conventional style of anime humor, that is another thing that becomes a lot more present. Actually, a lot of, just in general, these episodes feel a lot more conventional, like all around. And like I said, there's still Evangelion things there. It still sets itself apart, but not so much where it makes this show feel like this unique piece of art that you really started to get in those first 6 episodes. There are moments, I think, for me, where I think there are parts of these episodes which are just kind of weak. There's a lot that I can't necessarily talk about with my feelings in these episodes because I'll have to bring it up at a later date when we talk about later episodes. But I will say there are things here that I think are just kind of flaws. Asuka's introduction is one of the most regrettable bits of this entire series. I mentioned, I believe, in the last podcast, when Shinji enters Rei's room and they have that awkward interaction that's kind of sexual. It's like, every anime has that, like the guy falls on the girl and, ooh, I touch her boobie, and then they freak out. That kind of humor, which is just always awkward, in that episode was framed in a really different kind of way. It wasn't funny, it wasn't goofy, it was really uncomfortable, and it told you something about both characters. When Asuka shows up, they do a similar scene in the, oh my god, girl kind of thing that they do in anime, but it really doesn't have that connotation. There's really nothing transgressive about it. It's just your standard anime stuff, except she's 14 years old. So that shit was kind of weird. And there is a little bit of that in these episodes. I think that to the episode's credit, or to this batch of episodes credit, to the section of the series, there is absolutely a purpose why the show turns into this right now. And I think that becomes clear later in a way that really recontextualizes the episodes. And I will say, even aside from that, this show is still pretty damn good at doing the monster of the week thing. Each angel is wholly unique from the other ones, and the battles and the considerations that the characters make, despite the fact that a lot of things become extremely repetitive, they do separate these episodes out. And there are some really creative episodes here. Like, I really like the one where the power goes out and you have Rei, Shinji, and Asuka. They have to like really interact more than they ever have and try to build that sense of camaraderie to defeat the angel. They just never really do. And that's like another thing that separates this, is that they normally you would want this team of characters to build that sense of camaraderie so the audience can really attach to the team and root for them, but that just doesn't ever really happen in Evangelion. Like, you might root for individual characters. There might be those moments where it seems like they might start getting along, but that falls apart very fast every single time. And even though we're getting episode after episode of standard monster of the week kind of stuff, it just never feels like these characters like each other or want to really be here. And I think that they do a good job keeping up with that idea in these episodes, alongside just making it more of a fun mech show for a little while, which I still think it does pretty well.
Yeah, I'm glad we were on the same page on this one, because I definitely have, I kind of conveyed them as well, but I have 100% similar feelings. Like this, it starts to just feel like a conventional mech anime. There's not really much going on. I think what's so interesting about this show so far is you contextualize it in its place in history, and Gundam was gigantic. I mean, a powerhouse anime. So that's what I thought was so interesting about the first batch of episodes. It's like it's telling a similar story in a way, right? Like mech piloting and all that stuff and fighting back and those sorts of things, right? But in such a completely different way. And this batch of episodes didn't feel like that. This batch of episodes felt like it was telling that story in the same way. But I will 100% agree. Like those battles, even though it did kind of fall into a formula, were still very interesting and really cool and very unique. The thing that sprayed acid, I think that might be that same episode that you were talking about. But the one that like they were like trying to climb up and it's acid's pouring down on them, or when Asuka has to go down into the magma of the volcano to try to retrieve like a newborn angel, or not newborn, but like still in its cocoon, or who knows? We don't really know much about them yet at this point, but they're basically trying to find a live one. That was really interesting. So there's still a lot of cool stuff here, a lot of good stuff here, but I did feel like it really started to become more of the formula, and especially driven by what you had mentioned and what I had kind of alluded to as well, is like all this like very cliche, like, oh, it's a girl kind of humor. It just really is so off-putting thematically too from some of the other stuff that's going on here. it's just interesting. Like you have an episode where oh, what? Why can't I think of her name? Masato, right?
Yeah,
That's
the captain. Yeah.
yeah. You have an episode that like really dives so deep into her psyche, and then in the next episode, she's like drinking a beer, and it's like, oh, my boobies are out. Deal with it. And it's just like, okay, sure. Anyway, so yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I may, and you mentioned that these episodes might contextualize or be recontextualized or become recontextualized, and I'm interested to see how that might happen and what that might mean. But as of right now, this batch of episodes definitely was uh, left more of a little bit of a sour taste in my mouth than the first batch did. So I'm excited. Oh, but what I will mention is not to the point where I'm not excited to keep going. I think there's still enough good here for me to be interested and engaged to want to continue to explore like more of it, but this was definitely a much weaker batch than I felt the first one was.
Yeah, and I will say this. I would agree that these episodes are weaker. So and I think everybody kind of agrees on that. It's a pretty universally agreed upon thing. Like some of the episodes that are often considered the weakest are like always one of these, and that makes perfect sense. But I will again say, and this is just the downside to having to talk about the show this way. Um, it's impossible for us to talk about how it all works together when you have batches of episodes like this. The only context Steven has is the episodes before them. And in that way, yeah, they are a step down. I will say though, what I do really like about these episodes is um how good of a job the series does momentarily convincing you it is a totally normal show. And that is something that I do not think this series I don't think the series could have worked if it didn't do this. And that, although there are still things I just think shouldn't have been here, there are things where it's like, okay, I know you're trying to become conventional. I get that. But there are just things that are in conventional anime that you should have not done anyway. That is true, but I do really appreciate the purpose behind it, and I still think that they're entertaining. So it still does a good job at that. And I do want to mention, I think it's in one of these episodes, one of the most memorable sequences of this series is in one of these. It's the one where Shinji and Asuka have to like learn a dance so that they can become in sync enough to destroy certain angel, this like seemingly undefeatable angel. So they have to like learn this dance throughout the episode, and then when they go to battle the angel, the entire sequence has no sound effects. It's just the music that they are dancing to, or that they learned the dance to. And you watch this sequence performed almost like it's like a choreographed dance sequence in a fight, and that is really cool. And that is the one thing, like, despite the show feeling more conventional, it still cannot help itself but be like really, really stylish. And all that stuff still like just completely shines. Though there are fewer, I think, memorable images in these episodes, there are fewer super memorable scenes. It's still a very creative show. And I definitely think that's worth noting.
And also, I think during that scene, like people were calling out like the beauty of the craft of it as well, right? From what I remember.
The craft of what? I might have forgotten whatever you're mentioning because it's been a while since I
The
watched this
dance,
episode.
like while they were doing this dance battle,
Oh yeah,
not
yeah,
quite in that way, but also kind of in that way.
yeah.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to mention, I don't know if I even mentioned it last time. I must have mentioned it last time, but man, the look of this show is incredible. Like everything else aside, I just want to mention that this show just always looks incredible. There's so many like just from an like the I don't know how I'd put it, like the skeletoning of some of these moments, the poses, the angles, the shots, like it's just insane and it just looks so good. And it has that very nostalgic kind of mid 90s vibe to it as well. But even with that aside, like just some of the things that they were doing here, it just looks so good.
Yeah, and I think we should probably leave it at that.
And one thing quickly I
Unless,
wanted to mention about that, you know what helps also is the design of everything as too. Like the mechs, the Ava units are so slender and like formed that they can really do some cool looking things with those guys. So that's what really helps as well.
yeah, they put them in very interesting poses. They make the Ava units feel like this weird combination of being human, but also clearly being giant monsters at the same time. And the amount of just awesome poses and shots, it really emphasizes that huge lumbering quality that they obviously have. But then, like, you see that against how swiftly they're able to move, and it's just really strange. It
But
looks
I would like to have been in the design room, the in fiction design room when they were creating the different Ava units. They were like, "Oh man, 00's too blue. I think we need more of like a samurai purple look for the next one. The blue is not really doing it for me anymore." And then they're like, "Wait, what about red?" And make it look like a big scary demon.
yeah. Okay, well,
Important design decisions.
oh yeah, definitely, for sure. How can we make them look more like evil monsters? That'll
Right.
scare the attackers. Or maybe that was what they were thinking. Well, maybe we'll find out later. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if you want to give whatever version of final thoughts you have, but again, we're not going to, score or recommend her.
Right. Um yeah, this batch feels weaker. I think that would be my final thoughts on it. I was incredibly enamored and captured by those first 6 episodes. This block, I cooled on very much so. But that's not to say there aren't great moments here. And even though it does kind of become this much more formula driven monster of the week thing, that thing that it does is really good. And I was still engaged enough to want to continue watching. So I don't know where it goes from here, but I'm still interested to find out, even with what I think are a much cooler set of episodes.
All right, great. Well, I think we should just move on to the recommendations now. And these recommendations are going to be scary, everybody, because in 2 weeks it will be Halloween. So we are going to take a break on the Evangelion, because
Yes. Actually,
unfortunately, Evangelion is not Halloween really related. I mean, I guess you could make it that way, but that would be stupid. So we do have a tradition of doing horror episodes every Halloween. I don't want to break it.
yes, and I want to just warn everyone because if you're listening right now, these wrecks are jump scares.
Right.
That's how spooky they are.
Yeah, they're going to come out of nowhere. As in, we 1 second we won't be saying what the recommendation is, and then the next we will. So just
Right.
prepare yourself for that. So I guess we'll
And if you're listening in stereo, we'll be in your other ear.
So yeah, these are horror recommendations. Are they Halloween specific? Not necessarily, but we want to do a nice scary episode for you, as we always do, and I'll give it over to Steven to start.
Okay, Don, I am going to recommend to you a playlist on YouTube. I mean, technically, it's also, you can listen to it on Spotify, but it is called See, that was the jump scare. So I hope I prepared everyone. It is a series of ABBA parodies, each sung by a different classic horror monster slash villain. This is created by Brian David Gilbert, It came out last year, and there are more coming. I don't know if they will be there when you go to listen to it before our Halloween episode, so I will recommend to you the first 5, but if there are more, then we can talk about them too. Why not?
Sure, I'll say a day before the next episode, we should both check back just to make sure if anything had been added. Let's get that in so we can talk about all of it.
Yes.
That seems fair. All right. Um, well, Stephen, my recommendation to you is the film Eraserhead. Eraserhead is a 1977, I think, movie, directed, written, and produced and edited by David Lynch. It is a surrealist body horror film that is all in black and white. And this film took a really long time to make. I don't know the whole history, but it's a film which famously was in the works for years and years and years until it finally came out. And it was David Lynch's debut feature length film. He would later go on to do things like The Elephant Man and Blue Velvet, Mulholland Drive, and stuff like that. So we will talk about Eraserhead next episode. And that's all of that. So everybody be looking forward to not only our Halloween episode, but also 1,000 years from now when Stephen and I will do a podcast featuring a ghost and Stephen King's The Shining. These are two things you have to look forward to in the future. So I hope that keeps you coming back for more here on Get Recc'd.
And speaking of a feature, I would recommend everyone tune in to our next episode on Twitch where we stream, because we may have a special feature in that we may be joined by some very special guests.
Ooh, I don't know how to add to that, but yeah. Well, anyway, I should reiterate once again.
Let's just say they're very humorous.
Oh,
no bones about it. They're gonna be on the show. Let's just say some nasty pitches.
Yeah.
Some nasty pitches coming our way next time.
You never know. You never know what kind of guests will be on your screen. So, yeah, I would say make sure you tune into the video version of the podcast, but we don't really have an audio version right now. So that forces you to do it.
What if you're listening to us in a different tab?
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
Kind of like an audio
Just
version.
make sure you're able to give our guests a little gander, and say hello. You never know who's gonna be there. And anyway, really though, thanks everybody for watching. I will assume our next podcast will be on Halloween. Is that fair to say, Steven?
Yeah, no, probably not.
Okay, well, very close.
Probably the weekend before.
Okay, well that's totally fine. And with that, I guess those were our thoughts. Those were our recommendations. Get wrecked.